Welcome to the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we're going to talk about the 6th Airborne Division. And to help us break it down, we have Andrew Wheale, historian, PhD, and author of Ham and Jam, which, by the way, has to be one of the most epic code words in history, or at least definitely top 5. He'll probably explain all of that for us later. But first, welcome to the show, Andrew. And let's start with you telling us a bit about yourself and setting the stage for this. I mean, it's a huge topic, World War II, D-Day, but in the context of the 6th Airborne Division. Where does their story begin?
Sure. Well, hi, Max and Tony. Thanks for having me on your channel. So just a little bit about me. After a career in business, I decided to sort of return to academia, and I completed a doctorate, which I was fortunate enough to be able to turn into a book, which is Ham and Jam, which is what you just described. I've had a lifelong interest in military history, mainly interested in the Second World War, but also the Napoleonic Wars. I'm quite interested in that, and some other conflicts. And just to give you a little background to the book, before I talk about the background to the campaign and the division, when I started my doctorate, I had a crazy idea that I was going to do a study on the characteristics of all the elite regiments of the British Army, to sort of what had changed, what had stayed the same in terms of the way they worked. But I realised very rapidly that was just so much research to do that very gradually I boiled it down first to the Second World War, then to airborne forces and commandos. And in the end, that was still too much, so I had to just concentrate on 6th Airborne Division in Normandy. So here we are with the book. And moving on to talking about 6th Airborne Division and its place in the Second World War and D-Day. Obviously, the Allies, by 1942, were thinking and preparing to launch the second front against the Germans in occupied Europe. And 6th Airborne Division was formed essentially as the 2nd British Airborne Division. And it was formed, the formation of 6th Airborne Division really began in November 1942. Which is when my book starts, with the creation of 3rd Parachute Brigade, which was to step up to cover the fact that 1st Parachute Brigade had shipped out to North Africa to take part in the remains of the North Africa campaign and then further operations in the Mediterranean. So 6th Airborne Division did have an advantage, really, that it knew that its specific focus task was to take part in supporting the amphibious landings wherever they might take place on the coast of France to begin the liberation of Europe. And obviously, this is a tremendously challenging task, and the planning had been going on for a long time, as I say, 1942 onwards, perhaps even further back than that. And the Atlantic Wall was a formidable obstacle. The Germans had 3 years to build it up from the coast of Spain, running really all the way to the top of Norway. It was the entire sort of coastline of Europe, facing the Allied powers, which were going to use the United Kingdom as a launch pad. And airborne forces were very much viewed quite enthusiastically by the senior Allied commanders as a way to create a vertical envelopment, basically to use the flank above the Germans to outflank them from above, from the sky, to break through those formidable German defences facing them along the coast of occupied Europe.
Major General Gale played an important role in leading this division, Andrew, and I like the way you've said about the vertical envelopment. Now, I can imagine such a massive task needed strong leadership. Could you perhaps touch on how he led the 6th Airborne Division, and did that lead to its eventual success?
Sure. I mean, I have to say, I've got a great deal of time for Richard Nelson Gale, the Major General, the general who was appointed to command 6th Airborne Division. And he had, I mean, if you want, I can go back and talk a little bit about his career, if you wish. Would you like that?
I would like a little bit about his career, and then I also would like you to maybe just round it up with, if you could go back in time and have a drink with a guy, what would be something that you'd like to ask him? Something that gets lost between the sources, but maybe just start with a bit of background, and then maybe you could end with that one.
Yeah, sure. I think the thing about Gale, and this is an important part of his command style, is that if you read, he wrote 2 tremendous books. He wrote a number of books, actually. He was quite an accomplished author. He wrote books about military history going back to the biblical period, some of those great, like, chariot ancient battles. He wrote about those. But he wrote 2 books, essentially, about his own experience. His memoir for the 6th Airborne Division, obviously, but also a sort of general military biography. And Gale's military career began in 1915 when he was commissioned as a regular officer in the Worcestershire Regiment as World War One was raging. And interestingly, what happened was that he was in his memoir. He went to attend a course on machine gun tactics, and suddenly found, to his kind of interest, was that he'd actually been transferred to the new machine gun corps. He hadn't actually volunteered for it; he'd been signed over by his regiment. He served with great distinction in the machine gun corps, and he actually won the Military Cross later in the war. And going forward, at the end of World War One, as a regular, he stayed on in the army. He attended Staff College. He went out to India and the Northwest frontier. And by the time World War II broke out, he was working in the War Office, having worked on pamphlets, training pamphlets. And then he was working on what was known as the War Plan, which was the general plan that the French and the British had assembled, whereby essentially they'd build up their armies to the point they were at, kind of like in 1918. And then at the end of 1941, they'd launch a great offensive to destroy the Germans as they had at the end of World War One. Obviously, that was not to be because of the Blitzkrieg of 1940. But Gale had this tremendous amount of authority based on the fact that he was an MC winner from the First World War. And if you look at pictures of Gale, if you Google him, and the picture that appears on the front cover of my book, he's standing there bareheaded and he's wearing his Denison smock over his battle dress. He's got large Royal Artillery binoculars around his neck. He's smoking a cigarette. He's got a moustache, and almost certainly he's probably wearing jodhpurs and boots. And it's interesting to think about Gale sort of in that context. He was very much a guru, iconic figure in British Airborne Forces, because having commanded a battalion of the Leicester Regiment in the sort of period when the Germans may well have been able to land in 1940-41, he became commander of the 1st Parachute Brigade, and he took all that World War One experience with him into his new role. And as you look at that picture of him standing there bareheaded smoking a cigarette, bearing in mind that the vast majority of the soldiers in 6th Airborne Division hadn't seen any action before, he would have radiated a great deal of confidence and experience and just a presentation of somebody who knows what he's doing and he knows what he's talking about. And that kind of confidence, that authority, was a cornerstone of Gale's leadership style. Lord Lovat, the Commando commander, in his memoir, March Past, he actually said that when he first encountered Gale, he thought he was a red-faced, loud, blustering figure, but he soon got to know him and felt that and greatly respected him. So Gale was able to radiate this authority through his leadership style, but then he also had the iconic position of having been the first commander of 1st Parachute Brigade. So he was the number one expert, essentially, on parachute units in the sort of middle period of the war. Then he went away and he had a role in the War Office in the Air Directorate, coordinating with the RAF, before he then became the commander of 6th Airborne Division. But his style was very much one of confidence. Sort of, we beat the Germans before, we can beat them again. And then a bit further on, we'll talk a little bit about the things that made 6th Airborne Division so effective. But that was Gale's style. It was constant communication. He had a newspaper for 6th Airborne Division when it was in Normandy. And he was always cascading information, training, and, as I say, confidence down through his officers, which he'd carefully selected. And that was kind of the way that Gale's leadership worked. I think, coming on to your further question, if I actually met Gale in the pub, what question would I ask him? That's a very good question, actually. Nobody's asked me that before. I'm not sure what I would ask him, really. I think there'd be no point asking Windy Gale, did you ever fear that you might fail? Because I think he was such a confident and bluff individual, he would have just laughed, I think, if you asked him that question. Because as far as he was concerned, not winning was not an option. I think I might have asked questions about why some battalion commanders went further than others in terms of moving from battalion command to brigade command and sort of further on. I think that's probably the question I would have asked him. But he probably would have laughed again and probably offered to buy me another drink and avoid answering the question.
Such an epic photo that you mentioned, and we will be adding the link into the show notes, Andrew. Just one follow-up from me on that. I wonder if he would have been surprised at how the character of war had changed. Because he was in it from the start in the First World War and saw some of the static warfare. So I wonder if that would have come out in that barroom chat.
I think he was. I think it's interesting that he ended up in the. I mean, the fact that he joined as a regular, he wanted to be a soldier. That was what he wanted to do with his life, be a regular soldier. And I think it's interesting that he ended up in the Machine Gun Corps in the First World War, because again, that was another new corps, as were airborne forces in the Second World War. And he obviously adapted well to it, because he later won the Military Cross. So he won the Military Cross for coordinating machine gun fire to break up a German attack, and also for releasing some trapped horses that were attached to a broken down gun, effectively saving the horses, which obviously was very heroic because it all happened under fire. I think if you read his memoir, one of the things he talks about is the great danger to infantry is what he calls the undetected machine gun, the machine gun that you can't see. And I think that obviously remained true in World War II as it did in World War One. And I think the nature of fighting men, I think Windy, I don't think he probably thought they changed. And he's certainly another aspect of Windy Gale. He was something of a chameleon. He presented different fronts. And if you get my book, there's some different photographs of Windy Gale and also different photos of Windy Gale available for you to see sort of online in different outfits. And like the outfit I described, which is, I think, the front that he gave to his young soldiers in Normandy, where he's wearing these binoculars, he's smoking a cigarette. He looks tough. He looks like he's not messing around. And I think it's also significant in those pictures you find of Windy Gale when he's briefing soldiers before D-Day and then during the Normandy campaign. He's always bareheaded. And it occurred to me at one time that the reason why he probably was bareheaded was all the guys around him would have been wearing maroon berets or steel helmets. So if you walked into a crowded smoke-filled HQ of a British Airborne formation in Normandy, that's what you'd have seen. You'd have seen maroon berets, you'd have seen helmets, but he'd have been standing there with his head uncovered. So instantly people would have spotted him. And I think that's another thing he would have done to like identify himself and boost the confidence of his young soldiers. But again, in my book, coming back to that, there's another photograph of I've got him in what the British Army would call a number one uniform, red tabs, as a general officer. And he looks very debonair. I mean, he looks like David Niven or Eisenhower. And that's the way he would have presented when he was in high-level meetings, perhaps inter-service meetings with the Royal Navy and the RAF. And then there's other photographs. If you Google the King and Queen visiting 6th Airborne Division, Queen Elizabeth II's father, George VI, he visited airborne forces with the then Queen, the Queen Mother, as she became. And Gale looks extremely smart. He's wearing a combination of his jodhpurs, his number one uniform jacket, and a maroon beret. And again, he's kind of presenting this very sort of debonair look again. So I think he had different faces for different situations, which I think was a strength, again, of his leadership.
Well, if I ever went to the pub with Gale, I think my first question would be about that mustache. It's definitely, it's a true work of art. But more seriously, what stands out to me is how dynamic his leadership was. The way he could move seamlessly between those high-level meetings and frontline soldiers and adapting his presence and communication style. And I think this is something we still value in leadership today, that kind of versatility that makes any leader truly effective, not just in commanding, but also in inspiring confidence. And honestly, I can kind of picture him straight out of the Guns of Navarone. He has that kind of look that, that he could lead the charge himself. But since I'm a combat-oriented guy, I want to dig into the core of the 6th Airborne Division, and that's their combat jumps. You cover them in your book, and I would love to hear more about their first combat drops during the D-Day landings and how they played out for them.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, they were another aspect of Gale's leadership was meticulous, careful planning, but also simplicity within the plan, which is obviously linked to training as well. And the plan for 6th Airborne Division in the Normandy landings was to land in the middle of the night and to protect the eastern flank of the Allied landings. So the nearest amphibious landing beach then would have been Sword Beach, focusing around Weestrum, and 3rd Division, British 3rd Division, would have been on call. Well, it would have been their mission to link up with them as 3rd Division advanced. And essentially, the operation was broken down into two phases, Operation Tonga and Operation Mallard, and I'll talk a little bit about both. Operation Tonga was the one that was launched in the middle of the night. It was launched between sort of quarter to midnight through to about 3 a.m. And that included Operation Dead Stick, which was the capture of the two bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River, which obviously were absolutely key, capturing those two bridges. Robert Kershaw, who's another airborne historian, he worked out and estimated that by capturing those two bridges, essentially it made any Germans advancing from the eastern flank of the landings, it gave them a 5 to 6 hour detour they'd have to take to get to the other side of the river, because they'd have to cross on bridges much further down. So capturing those bridges was absolutely key. And then Operation Tonga, as I discussed, it featured 3rd Parachute Brigade landing and essentially carrying out quite destructive battalion size assaults, or even you could almost term them as raids, destroying bridges over the River Dive and also German HQs. And obviously the most famous probably action of Operation Tonga, apart from Dead Stick, is the assault by 9 Parachute Battalion on the Merville Battery, which I'm sure probably many listeners have read about. And essentially they landed in the operational planning for the landings. Gale and his staff had assumed a loss of men through scattered drops of perhaps around 25% of their strength. But once they'd landed, it became apparent the 3rd Brigade was actually down to only around 30 to 33% of headcount. So around 65 to 70% of their men were scattered. I've interviewed some veterans who were scattered, and many of them were able to get back to the units over the next sort of 48, 72 hours. But many of them were scattered and engaged the Germans wherever they could, similarly with the American airborne forces on the other flank. But even though they were scattered and they were down to 30%, and you imagine you're in a section of 10 men, they're your 10 mates that you go to the pub with, and suddenly when you land, there's only you and 2 others. So that would have been massively demoralizing for many military formations. But because of the simplicity of the communication and the planning and the aggression imbued by Gale, they just got on with the job. And they effectively achieved all the objectives of Operation Tonga. And then they fell back to a defensive line, which was essentially centered on Ronville, where Gale's divisional HQ was. And in the core of that was 5th Parachute Brigade, which had landed to get this core defence in the middle of the airborne perimeter and to protect the landing and drop zones. They'd only suffered, well, I say only, but they only had about 60% of their strength available, and they were involved in heavy fighting. So that was Operation Tonga. And as the sun came up on D-Day, there was this airborne bridgehead formed by 3rd and 5th Parachute Brigades, holding the line, engaged with various elements of German forces that were in a somewhat confused state, but advancing on the British airborne troops wherever they could. I interviewed one veteran, Nick Archdale, who was the mortar platoon commander of 7th Parachute Battalion, which was intended to reinforce the operation by the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry at Pegasus Bridge. He was actually part of that battle group. And if the Ox and Bucks had failed to capture those bridges, 7th Parachute Battalion had ropes and wood and the training to actually build or repair bridges, to actually make those bridges again and hold them if the Ox and Bucks had failed and their gliders had been shot up, for example. But Nick, when he landed, he discovered that all his 3-inch mortars had been lost. And he ended up commanding this band of odds and sods, as he put it, armed with a strange collection of weapons. And on the morning and afternoon of D-Day, they ended up defending the hamlet of Le Port, which isn't far from Benneville. If you actually visit the Normandy battlefields, it's not far at all from Pegasus Bridge. But Nick explained to me when I interviewed him that they were attacked with such extraordinary vigour by what turned out to be some engineers from German 716 Division. They attacked them so hard with such aggression that for a time, Nick and his men actually thought that the amphibious landings had failed and the Germans were effectively mopping up. But they held their ground. They fought really hard. And by the end of the day, approximately around 11 p.m., they were aware that there were British amphibious landed troops that were advancing on them. And it was actually the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. And Nick said that they were actually concerned that the British Tommies would actually kill them, mistaking them for Germans. So some of his guys were actually like leaning out of the windows at the port, waving their maroon berets, just so that the Tommies knew not to shoot them up. But that's how tough the fighting was. But they hung on everywhere and held that bridgehead. Then the final operation which took place around 9 p.m., was Operation Mallard, which had a massive effect operationally, which brought in 6th Air Landing Brigade, which had the glider battalions had a higher head count than the parachute battalions, and they also had 6-pounder anti-tank guns, which obviously was a great advantage in fighting German armoured vehicles. But 247 gliders brought 6th Air Landing Brigade into the bridgehead, and that had quite a psychological effect on the Germans, because obviously it's interesting because last summer I was out walking the dog and I saw a glider in the air, and just one glider on its own in the air is quite majestic and it's kind of haunting. But if you imagine if you're in a combat situation, suddenly the sky, for a start off, the sky's full of a mass of escorting Spitfires and Typhoons, and then a mass of transport planes, and then the release of, in stages, in waves of 247 gliders. It'd be extremely intimidating. And some Germans who witnessed it actually thought that Montgomery had a spare 2nd Airborne Division that he just decided to throw in at the end of D-Day, which had a massive demoralising effect on many German defenders. And if you look at the records at Kew at the National Archive in the UK, there's actually a report that some Enigma intercepts were collated for Churchill for his perusal, recording that the Germans actually lost their head at Carpigny airfield. They actually panicked when they saw these gliders and started to sort of a bit of a precipitous retreat, just showing the effect of that massive air landing, which took place at 9 o'clock on D-Day, and which really cemented the position of 6th Airborne Division. And it also was a huge boost for all the amphibious landed troops as they saw these gliders come in. And obviously their energy must have been at quite a low level, having come across the channel and faced an amphibious assault and then, having to fight inland. But to then see that, it must have been a tremendous boost.
What a sight that must have been.
All right, quick checkpoint. If you're finding value in this episode, leave us a review on your app. It really makes a difference. Watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button to stay sharp. Now back to it.
Andrew, you're saying iconic, and I'm just thinking to myself, from exercises or operations, and on a very, very minor level, when the illumination mortars go up and it breaks the darkness, it's like this kind of flash of, you get sight of things just for a short time. And I can just I can sort of imagine what it must have been like with those gliders kind of zooming in like that. It must have been sort of the opposite, kind of, here's a bit of blitzkrieg in a new way for you, for the Germans.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, something that struck me as I was doing my research, it's interesting, and we'll talk a bit more about the further battles as we go on with this conversation, but it's interesting that when British Airborne Forces were formed in 41, going back to the very first sort of converted commando battalion, really, 11 SAS, at that time of the war, the British Army was short of decisive victories against the German Army. But 6th Airborne Division played a key role in eliminating German 716 Division. And then it withstood attacks from 21st Panzer Division, 7, 11 and 346 German divisions. Obviously, it was supported by conventional role forces around it on that eastern side of the lodgement. But it's, tremendous victories that they were winning. And when you compare them to early in the war, it was a sort of set of great victories.
And how did they get there? I mean, they were taking on an overwhelming task, but as we've heard so far, their cohesion, ability to operate independently, and all of that was exceptional. Can you talk a bit about their training, how they were equipped, and how that shaped their combat performance?
Sure, yeah. I mean, they were British Airborne Forces generally. Initially, 1st Parachute Brigade was recruited from 11 SAS, which was the Special Air Service Battalion, which had been converted from commandos. They became first Parachute Battalion in the Parachute Brigade, and then volunteers filled out the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th battalions, just volunteers. But they very rapidly realised that they have to create units far more quickly. So they essentially adopted a conversion process where they take an existing infantry unit and they'd announced to the troops that they were going to become an airborne unit, and they'd give those troops the opportunity, if they didn't want to be airborne troops, to go to another battalion of that regiment and then backfill it with more volunteers. So that in many ways was how the majority of that's how the battalions of the airborne battalions of 6th Airborne Division were formed.
That is indeed a pretty strong starting point, having men who were already hardened and up for the challenge right from the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, and what they do is the training that they undertook was extremely vigorous. They did pre-parachute training at Hardwick Hall, which was like tough marches, a lot of infantry fighting training. And then they did their parachute training at Ringway, which later became Manchester Airport. And they'd all carry out 8 drops. Eventually, each airborne parachute soldier would do 8 drops to get his wings, which would include a night drop. And it would also include a drop, which was then followed by a sort of company-level infantry assault exercise. So I've never jumped out of a plane. I don't know if either of you two have done any parachuting.
Unfortunately, yes.
I think it's quite a scary prospect. And I think that obviously forms that bond, that cohesive bond. I mean, jumping out of a door in the side of an aeroplane with all your mates and then landing and then carrying out action. It's a cornerstone of airborne identity and that kind of cohesion that forms. So they'd had all this infantry training at sort of corps level, at the Army Air Corps level. They'd had their parachute training. And then they were posted to parachute battalions in 6th Airborne Division. And then obviously all the training started to take place that was to do with the forthcoming operation against the Atlantic Wall. And Gale essentially focused on sort of 3 elements of training. He made it quite simple. They did really serious infantry combat training, which included street fighting training in the bombed out rubble of Southampton. They also did all the battalions also did training involving bridges, whether it was like capturing bridges, mending bridges, jumping into the river. So you could look at bridges from underneath and how you're going to fix it. And then finally, they did training and they had plans for how to resist German mechanized or tank attacks. And they did it's all included in my book. They did a sort of a training where they called it the anti-tank hedgehog, how a parachute battalion would like close up and make sure all its weapons, all its limited number of heavy weapons or whatever it had to hand, interlocked to fend off German mechanized assaults. Because obviously they appreciated, they were completely candid and realistic. If the Germans launched a really serious counterattack to try and punch through to the sea, it would feature half-tracks, armoured cars and panzers. And in his plan, Gale actually identified an area to the south of the airborne bridgehead, which he actually called the anti-tank killing ground. And that's where the concentrated anti-tank fire of the glider brigade would be focused, because that was the wide open space where he thought the Germans would launch a mechanised attack. So just moving on to their equipment, obviously you've got these untried but enthusiastic and increasingly capable infantrymen. But the problem they've got is because of the nature of airborne warfare and the delivery, they're going to be arriving by parachute or glider. Their equipment was of a very light scale compared to a conventional role British Infantry Division, which had all sorts of vehicles, fully motorised, armoured cars, supporting tanks from a tank or an armoured brigade. What 6th Airborne Division had? It had 6-pounder guns. It had some 17-pounders, not many. It had 75mm M1/M116 American-made 75mm pack howitzers. It had a regiment of those, but a small regiment. And it also had Tetrarch tanks, which belonged to 6th Airborne Armoured Reconnaissance Regiment. And they were quite thinly armed, and they only had a 2-pounder gun and a machine gun on them. So they were very, very lightly armed. So they were heavily relying on that element of surprise, which is something I explore in the book, and also this vertical envelopment shock effect operationally and both tactically, and then obviously rapidly moving to secure their objectives, and then really just hanging on until they were relieved by the amphibious forces. So that was the compensation for the light scale of equipment, was this simple plan. Every man knew his task and simple objectives, landings close to the objectives, and then making the most of all the weapons they've got, and then obviously just hoping and assuming that the amphibious forces would be able to stick to their timetable to relieve them.
I mean, to me, it almost sounds like a mix between gung-ho and meticulous planning in a way. On the one hand, they were taking major risks with light equipment and untested troops, but on the other, it was a simple and realistic plan that made success possible. So, I mean, sometimes in large military operations, you see these overly ambitious objectives that mostly rely on pure audacity, but this feels more like a calculated gamble, and I respect that. I like that.
I think something that Gale did. If you look at the map, there's a few maps in my book. If you kind of look at it, it's the way it works is that all their positions are kind of like overlapping, like Venn diagrams. And a key battle that was fought soon after the landings was fought by 12 and 13 battalions of 5th Parachute Brigade, where the Germans launched infantry attacks across, trying to cover across drop zone N, which was the main 6th Airborne landing zone. And they defeated it with interlocking heavy machine gun fire, supporting each other with other supporting elements like the artillery, and co-opted firepower from surrounding conventional role forces. And it is very reminiscent of, it kind of chimes with Gale winning his MC at the end of World War One. And it's like, there is this like robust, there's some, whatever redundancy that Gale's been able to find in his like force allocation, he's made best use of it. And all the defences are overlapping. And it's, you can imagine if the Germans they launched big attacks, but the harder they drove at 6th Airborne Division, the way it was set up in terms of the rivers and the terrain, it would have just made it a tougher and tougher nut to crack as you compress 6th Airborne, because all their units would have just fallen back on Ronville and the two bridges, and it would have been, and also obviously there's that nature of airborne troops where they're probably less bothered about being encircled than other troops, for instance, like the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. They were encircled, but it was less of an issue for them because they were used to it as airborne troops.
What a story. And Andrew, when you think about it, like these guys being dropped behind enemy lines, and then just to your point, they're used to being encircled, whereas Blitzkrieg was the idea that you envelop rapidly. And for example, with the French army, they retreated, so much confusion. But here you found some forces doing something that's really counterintuitive, right? And kind of on that note, could you maybe give us a line or two just on the main battles and engagements that 6th Airborne Division faced? As
I said, I mean, one example, which I'm perhaps talk about a little bit later on, just as an illustration of when 6th Airborne Division came under a lot of pressure, was the Battle of Breville. But just those initial battles around D-Day and the few days following, the assault on the Merville battery, where Terence Otway had a very detailed and involved plan to capture or completely destroy the battery, and all of that went out of the window. He had a subsidiary operation which would have involved a glider force landing directly on top of the battery as his assault went in. But he had to abandon all of that and he had very limited heavy weapons, and he only had around 250 men. And he had to launch just a full-blown assault on the Merville battery with what he had. And they still prevailed. And if any of the listeners, I imagine some of the listeners may well have been to Normandy. And if you go to Merville, the area where the combat takes place, the Merville battery itself is probably maybe 3 or 4 football pitches. And there's this tremendous battle, this ferocious battle fought between 250 British parachute troops against this entrenched battery position of Germans. And at the end of it, there was only around 89 parachute battalion men left on their feet. But they did the job. It's a tremendous battle, much written about. But if you stand on the top of one of those casements that form the Merville battery, even though the guns that they contain were old Czech 100mm guns, you would be looking straight down the throat of Sword Beach. And if those guns had really got going, with their observers feeding back by radio targets of opportunity on that beach, it would have been appalling. And even if the Royal Navy had knocked it out very rapidly, which the Navy was ready to do if 9 Parachute Battalion hadn't been able to manage it, tremendous casualties would have still been caused. But that was a ferocious battle where the Airborne Division prevailed. And all sorts of other different, but all these battles that took place as part of Operation Tonga. 8th Parachute Battalion were very badly scattered. The Midlands Parachute Battalion but they were still able to destroy bridges around Troarn, turning the River Dive into a further riverine barrier to German opportunity to move forward. And then it's a less glamorous kind of operation, but Alistair Pearson, who was the very tough Scottish commander of 8th Battalion, they occupied the Bois de Bavant, which is this kind of elevated wooded area, which you can see quite easily from the two bridges. It's like this sort of upland area. It looks a little bit like a country park. But because his manpower is very limited, he essentially waged sort of guerrilla warfare in the Bois de Bavant, really aggressive patrolling to just stop the Germans wanting to go anywhere near it. And in that way, he prevailed. And that was just a non-stop series of extremely tough skirmishes. He was supported by other elements, obviously, of the division, including some of the light tanks from the Armoured Airborne Reconnaissance Regiment. But that is quite a notable sort of period where the 8th Battalion occupied that wooded hill. And then, as I said before, that the defence of Ranville by the 12th and 13th Battalions, making the most of their heavy weapons and calling in artillery fire from other nearby units, as well as the integral firepower of the division. That was a tremendous defence. And some of the opposition that they were facing, there was Kampfgruppe von Luck from 21st Panzer Division. Hans von Luck was a veteran of Russia and North Africa, extremely capable brigadier in the 21st Panzer Division. He's written a very good memoir of his time in World War II. And they managed to hold him back, obviously again with the support of other surrounding units. But they held that ground. And the action moves away from 6th Airborne Division as the Normandy campaign develops, and all the armoured divisions, the infantry divisions, the tank and the armoured brigades, they all push south in their big attempt to capture Caen. But 6th Airborne Division manages to freeze that eastern flank, which would have been the easiest way to roll up the Allied bridgehead. And Gale's command grows, which reflects the capability of Gale. Gale ends up taking under command 2 commando brigades, the Princess Irene Dutch Infantry Brigade, and also the Belgian Infantry Brigade. So almost within First Corps, Gale's almost got this kind of like light corps of his own, effectively protecting that eastern flank. And they sit there and they're ready to take advantage of any opportunities operationally that might come along. If you read the divisional war diary, when Operation Goodwood takes place, where all the British armoured divisions burst out of that Orne bridgehead, pushing south, 6th Airborne Division's ready to sort of steam forward in their wake if the Germans start to collapse to try and capture Cabourg and some of those French ports further along the coast, moving in the direction of Le Havre. So they're ready to go, but they manage to capture this terrain in the first hours of D-Day, and then they just manage to freeze and just send that part of the front into suspended animation, and the Germans just can't get to grips with it at all. All through all these all these battles, all these assaults, constant aggressive patrolling and skirmishing, while making use of and co-opting fire support from the Royal Navy and other artillery regiments from other divisions around. But they managed to freeze it with all these actions and this patrolling.
I think before we move on from the action side to talk about combat effectiveness, I got to ask you, just out of my personal curiosity, can you explain the title of your book and what is the story behind the code words ham and jam in this context?
Yeah, well, ham and jam were the code words for the capture of the two bridges, the bridge over the River Orne and the Caen Canal. And they were very simple code words which they expected would be shouted into the radio above the sound of fighting. Ham and jam, just to let the amphibious forces and the HQ back in the UK know that the two bridges have been captured, because it was such a critical objective for the success of D-Day, which would take place as the sun came up the following day. And that was it. Ham and jam. Ham for one bridge, jam for the other.
Ham and jam. I love that. I mean, it just sounds iconic, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, keeping it simple under pressure is key in combat. And it's one of those things that sticks in your head. And I mean, can you get a better set of code words than that? Thank you for breaking it down, because it definitely triggers my Second World War II nerd nerve here.
I can actually do a bit better than that because I found the quote, because there's a quote in John Howard's, who's the commander of the Oxford books. And I'll read you the quote, actually. I've just found it.
Go for it.
So just to quote John Howard, he says, it was just 10 minutes after we'd landed, Tappenden began sending out the success signal, ham for the canal bridge and jam for the river bridge. We were hoping that this message would be picked up by Brigadier Poet, who had a wireless set on our net, having dropped with a special stick of Pathfinder paratroopers, head of the main force at about the same time as we landed. Tappenden continued to send out the message with monotonous regularity, positioned alongside me, and I well remember his voice repeating over and over again, hello, four dog, ham and jam, ham and jam. And I'm certain I heard Tappenden eventually say, ham and bloody jam, because I think there was an issue with the radio, and they're not sure the message even got through.
Love it.
That is absolutely fantastic. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that builds legends.
For sure.
And Andrew, in your book, you focus a lot on something called combat effectiveness, which is obviously a key factor in how these operations played out. So I think before we get into the details, can you first break it down for our listeners? What exactly is combat effectiveness and how do you go about measuring it?
This is probably the most sort of techie part of the book in a way. And I consulted all sorts of different sort of theorists to get an idea. There's a difference between fighting power and combat effectiveness. Fighting power is more firepower and like weight. It's like offensive mass. Whereas combat effectiveness is really about achieving objectives, but still staying in a reasonable enough shape to be able to perform further operations and tasks. And I looked at airborne operations in the Second World War, sort of across the entire sort of span of 39-45. And then I compared them to how 6th Airborne performed. And I think the one word that comes through about airborne operations in the Second World War, one key word is Pyrrhic. And effectively, you have to measure the combat effectiveness of airborne forces in the Second World War by how much of a cost is incurred capturing an objective that might prevent you from actually defending it from an enemy counterattack. So my definition of combat effectiveness for Second World War airborne forces was they've always got to seize the objective. They've always got to be successful. As we've said before, they've landed from the sky. They can't retreat. There's nowhere to retreat to. So if they fail to capture the objective, they're probably going to be annihilated because they just have nowhere to go. But that being said, once they've captured the objective, they have to be in good enough shape. They can't afford a Pyrrhic victory. They have to be in good enough shape to hold that position until they're relieved by conventional role troops. So that was my definition of combat effectiveness for airborne forces in the Second World War, to always achieve their objective, but not at the cost of such a Pyrrhic victory that they then can't hold it.
And building on that combat effectiveness, and while we also, as you mentioned, it's getting a little bit technical now, but just one more while we're in that line, and it's about how British airborne doctrine evolved over this time and maybe a little bit before this.
Sure. Well, this is really interesting. I mean, this was very interesting when I researched this for the book. Essentially, a lot of the way that Britain thought about airborne operations obviously was stimulated by the performance of German airborne forces at the start of the war. And if you look at, there's this tremendous shock effect of German airborne forces. It's a key part of Blitzkrieg, and Guderian wrote about it in his Blitzkrieg theory book. Straight away, at the very start of the war, they achieved successes capturing airfields. Aalborg in Denmark, Fornebu and Sola in Norway, with very small numbers of troops. They captured these airfields, which allowed further German troops to be flown in by their pretty considerable fleet of Junkers 52 aircraft. And then the real shocker comes with the capture of the fortress of Aben-Amel and those other fortresses in Belgium as the Panzers sweep forward. And it's worth bearing in mind that in 1940, it took the Germans 11 days, 60,000 men and around 5,000 casualties to capture the same forts that in 1940 only needed 414 airborne troops, which completely unhinged the Belgian defence. So bouncing on from that, in July 1940, Churchill calls for a formation of around 5,000 airborne troops, because it's obviously something that it's a major military development that Britain wants to be involved in. And then sliding forward, if you look at the development of British airborne doctrine, unfortunately, because of the pile of state that we're in at the start of the war, where we're essentially concentrating on the Battle of Britain, defeating the Blitz that's destroying all the cities, and obviously preparing for Operation Sea Lion if it comes. We tried to do airborne forces on the cheap, and we planned to co-opt RAF heavy bombers to tow the gliders and also to drop the paratroopers. And this was kind of a curse that affected British airborne forces throughout the war, and it also led to considerable inter-service rivalry with the RAF, which we might talk about in a minute. But by the time Brooke, who was Home Forces commander, was exercising British troops, he conducted an enormous exercise in February 1941, which was to sort of rehearse every unit around the British Isles to resist Operation Sea Lion. And that exercise included no less than 15 regiments of German paratroopers. If you count them all up, 15 regiments, about 5 or 6 divisions of German airborne troops would have landed as part of Brooke's notion of a German invasion of the UK. And then that need for airborne forces, that belief and commitment, is totally reinforced by Operation Mercury in May 1941, when there's approximately 50,000 Allied troops, including a lot of battle-hardened Kiwi and Australian troops on the island of Crete. And even with warning from Enigma, Freiburg was warned by Enigma decrypts, the German airborne troops, supported by flown-in German mountain troops, succeed in capturing Crete. And it's a massive shock. And that completely confirms the need for airborne troops as far as the British are concerned, which develops their doctrine. It leads directly to the formation of like the Parachute Brigade, the 1st Airborne Division, which later becomes 1st Airborne Division. And then doctrine rapidly sort of moves along with the development of Airborne Operations Pamphlet number 1 in May 1943. There's a very key doctrinal document, a memorandum called the Employment of Airborne Forces on the 18th of October 1943, which includes the post-Sicily, Italy, North Africa lessons. And it's really starting to firm up then. They understand the importance of cooperation between the air forces and the army, and the proximity of of drop and landing zones to objectives, all that kind of stuff. And then and that moves forward. And then obviously there is an airborne operations pamphlet at the end of the war, which kind of consolidates the lessons of Market Garden and Arnhem. But the doctrine develops. It's always inhibited by a lack of aircraft resources to carry the troops. You know, this curse of trying to do things on the cheap because we're so short of aircraft at the start of the war. It's always a problem. But more and more through practice, through having seen the German operations, particularly Crete, the fear of German airborne forces taking part in the amphibious landing in Britain, all that comes together with our own experience to form this doctrine that moves forward.
Quick pause. If you're enjoying this episode, why not buy us a beer? It's the best way to keep Underground Strategy sharp and running. Hit undergroundstrategy.com/support to fuel the mission. Cheers to you. Let's get back into it. We've been talking a lot about how British airborne doctrine was shaped by German operations. But I want to jump a bit ahead. After Normandy, and not just for the 6th Airborne, but across all airborne operations, how did their experiences here influence later airborne doctrine and tactics?
I think if you look forward at Operation Market Garden, and you look at Operation Varsity, the jump across the Rhine, both Market Garden and Varsity take place during the daylight, and I think the scattering that was suffered with the Normandy drops, I think they viewed that as like just awful, unnecessary waste at that level. And obviously the way to fix that is once you're gaining that operational theatre superiority over the Germans by the time of Market Garden in September 1944, and then obviously in early 45 when you jump the Rhine, it's necessary for the operations to take place during the daylight to eliminate as much scattering as possible. That's the key, I think, doctrinal change, learning from lessons in Normandy. Obviously, without going into the whole Arnhem thing, there was an issue with Arnhem where the drop zones for Arnhem were too far from the key objective of Arnhem Bridge. That was certainly an issue which, should have been picked up on for sure. And if you read Martin Middlebrook's book about Arnhem, he discusses a conversation. He discusses a conversation that he had with the curator of the Airborne Forces Museum, who in turn recalled a conversation that he'd had with Richard Gale talking about Arnhem, where Richard Gale had said that he'd have like had drop zones very close, almost on top of the spires of Arnhem, regardless of losses of people drowning in the River Rhine. He'd have done that. And interestingly, in Martin Middlebrook's book, Gale went back to the curator and swore him to secrecy, but Middlebrook's got it in his book.
I mean, I think they had to make these harsh decisions, right, Andrew? It's not like they were... I mean, of course, afterwards, history maybe might cast them in a certain light, but with that kind of industrialized warfare, I don't know what other choice they would have had, right? I'm not trying to justify anyone's actions, but I don't know if you know what I'm getting at there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm not a great student of... I have to admit, I'd put my hands up. I am not a great student of market garden. I know a lot about it. But, yeah, I mean, for sure. It's interesting if you look at sort of the diary of the state of the planning and the staging of Operation Market Garden, and there's a document I found in Kew at the National Archive when I was doing my research around the start of September 1944. The British have just managed to capture 11th Armoured Division has captured Antwerp under Pip Roberts, and there's a moment near Mons as they go through Belgium where they capture around 25,000 Germans in kind of like a fleeing pocket, like a moving pocket. They capture around 25,000 Germans, and they're from like a plethora of different divisions. And you look at it, and like, I think if you were planning Market Garden at that moment, at the start of September 1944, it does look like the Germans are on the run and you've got them beaten. So you probably think it was worth the risk of launching that operation because it looked like it had a pretty good chance of winning through.
We've talked a lot about cohesion, leadership, and success in the 6th Airborne Division. But looking at their operations, what do you think are the most important lessons they offer from military leadership today? Are there any specific takeaways that still hold relevance in modern warfare?
Sure. I mean, I've got a diagram at the back of my book, which I use to try and illustrate Gale's leadership style and how it moves to success. And the key aspects that you can take away from 6th Airborne Division is very careful leadership selection. The leaders were very carefully selected, and there's an emphasis on competence and aggression, and also enthusiasm and knowledge of airborne warfare. Not all the leaders were like airborne pioneers. I mean, the most experienced men in the division were the battalion commanders, which is pretty key. But that set a tone of leadership. Alistair Pearson, when he took over 8th Parachute Battalion, they'd had some bad luck, and Gale had sacked the battalion commander. He'd moved, or at the very least, he'd moved away that battalion commander from being in charge of that unit. And Alistair Pearson turned up, and he stepped out of his car, immaculate, out of his staff car, and he looked round, and he turned to the officers and he said that he wanted the whole place cleaned, and he'd be back in 24 hours, and he wanted every man in a new uniform, and then he just drove off. And that just set the tone of like Alistair Pearson's command of that battalion. And they went on to fight this ferocious, almost guerrilla warfare in the Bois de Bavent, which I described earlier on, where they just made it completely impossible and unpalatable for the Germans to try and patrol in the Bois de Bavent. It was a nightmare for the Germans, and he managed to hold this key feature with very few men, really. And it was all about aggression, the fact that he'd been carefully selected as a leader of a battalion. So certainly leadership selection is key lesson for modern military operations to learn from 6th Airborne Division, but also very effective and relevant training, as I said, infantry fighting, resisting German mechanized assaults and bridges, because there's bridges involved in what they've got to do. Then very simple plans. Every man knows what he's got to do. on the night of D-Day when he's dropped, and then he's got to retreat to a location, which is what he's going to defend. Very simple plans. And then an emphasis on aggression, adaptation of whatever weapons and firepower you've got to hand, and also innovation. Jack Norris, who's the Royal Artillery Commander of the division, he was very pragmatic, and he appreciated that the 75mm howitzers weren't that powerful a firepower element. But what he did do is he used the net of all his airborne artillery liaison officers and observers to co-opt and pull in the considerable artillery firepower of surrounding British infantry divisions, and also the core assets of First Corps, and further back, the Royal Navy. Bearing in mind that British infantry divisions would have had 72 25-pounder guns each, which is a tremendous amount of firepower. And Montgomery also encouraged all the divisional commanders to treat that body of 25-pounders not as separate batteries of 8 guns. He encouraged them to use them as one block of 72 guns. And you don't want to be there when that lands on you.
That's a concentration of power right there, of firepower.
Yeah.
And Andrew, I think we'd struggle to find a modern professional military or force who would disagree with those lessons that you've mentioned right there. And as we go towards the close of this, are there any future projects that you're working on, or do you want to mention a little bit about your book? We'll, of course, just in terms of, the name and the publisher, etc., and we will, of course, add it in the show notes.
Sure. I mean, it's the book's published by Hellion Publishing. It's called Ham and Jam, 6th Airborne Division in Normandy. That's the book. It is, I don't know, a tremendous amount of research went into this book. It's not, I mean, it doesn't really get into the sort of blow by blow, the combat. I very much kind of my research question for the PhD, which is what the book's based on, is how did 6th Airborne Division generate their combat effectiveness? And the themes that I identified were leadership, training, and innovation. And then more and more, it just kept pointing to the guy with the moustache holding a cigarette on the front of the book, because he was a very special leader. So there's a lot about Gale in the book, but hopefully people who are interested in leadership, planning for combat operations, and training, all the stuff I've talked about, hopefully they'll get a lot out of it.
Yeah, and often with military history, we find just that what you've said, Andrew, that we know it's kind of a little bit passé at the moment, but great person, maybe great man theory in the past, but great person theory is still there in leadership. We still look towards that strong person in times of crisis, and I think that will still it'll echo into the future, I'm sure. A big thank you having you on today, Andrew. It's been an absolute pleasure. And, I've enjoyed every minute of it. And last words to you, Max.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Andrew. If there is one lesson I'm taking away from this, it is that we should always trust the man with the mustache to lead us to safety. Andrew, it's been a pleasure exploring Ham and Jam with you. I feel like we could talk about this for hours, preferably over a pint or two. Thanks again for joining us, and to all our listeners, we will be back next week. Until then, take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.